Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. The Israeli cabinet will meet on Friday to approve the brokered ceasefire agreement. Both US President Joe Biden and incoming President Donald Trump claim credit for the ceasefire talks. And the UK promises Ukraine a 100-year partnership to support the country's defence, energy and trade as a Russian drone is shot down from the sky. To our top story, and the Israeli cabinet will meet on Friday to approve the brokered ceasefire. That's according to Israeli media. A government spokesman had previously said the deal had not been finalized yet, and the team was continuing efforts to reach a solution. Meanwhile, hundreds of protesters have gathered in Jerusalem to demonstrate against the ceasefire. They believe the deal is bad for Israel and the country has surrendered to Hamas. Hamas say at least 73 Palestinians were killed in Israeli strikes since the ceasefire was announced. Let's go live to Tel Aviv now to speak to our reporter, Blake Sifton. Blake, thank you so much for joining me this evening. Last night, it looked like the ceasefire was all going ahead. We're now being told the cabinet meeting will take place tomorrow. What more do we know at this stage?
Yes, that's right. We've had details emerging in the last few moments in Israeli media that the final hurdles, the final issues on a deal have been ironed out and that the cabinet will meet on Friday, as you say. Earlier on Thursday, the Israeli Prime Minister's office had accused Hamas of reneging on certain parts of the deal, on pushing for more concessions, and specifically this related to the list of the names of Palestinian prisoners who will be exchanged for hostages in the deal that is expected to take place on Sunday. But as you've said, it seems that the Israeli government, their concerns have been assuaged. Hamas had said that they were fully committed to the deal, and now it does appear as if the deal will proceed as normal. At least the cabinet meeting will proceed as normal on Friday.
Blake, there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the deal. Does Benjamin Netanyahu actually have the support to get this deal approved tomorrow?
When the cabinet meeting, the security cabinet and wider cabinet meetings are held tomorrow, it is expected that Benjamin Netanyahu will have the votes, will have the support to get the deal approved. That's despite some pretty aggressive and steadfast opposition to the deal from the far right, including Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. They are opposed to this deal as they've been opposed to any prospect of a ceasefire deal since essentially the war began. However, even if they were to leave the government in protest of this deal, centrist leader Yair Lapid has said that he would step in and he would give his party's votes to prop up the governing coalition in order for a deal to go through.
73 people have been reportedly killed in Israeli strikes on Gaza since a deal was agreed. Is this Israel's last-ditch attempt to destroy Hamas?
Traditionally, ahead of ceasefires, we have seen an uptick in violence and attacks by the Israeli military. We saw that ahead of the ceasefire with Hezbollah in Lebanon. This, of course, is of no solace to the people of Gaza, who have suffered immeasurably under this war. The last 15 months, more than 46,000 people have been killed in Gaza, according to local health authorities. Hamas, for their part, have warned that continuing Israeli attacks in the days leading up to this deal do risk potentially harming or killing the hostages mere days before the first number of them are expected to be released.
Blake Sifton in Tel Aviv, thank you so much for joining me this evening. To Washington now, and US President-elect Donald Trump says his victory in the election is why Israel and Hamas have agreed on a ceasefire and a hostage deal. However, President Joe Biden is still in the White House for a few more days and credits the hard work of his administration. Caroline Malone reports.
After 8 months of nonstop negotiation, my administration, a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached by Israel and Hamas.
US President Joe Biden making this major announcement just before he exits the White House.
This plan was developed and negotiated by my team and will be largely implemented by the incoming administration. That's why I told my team to keep the incoming administration fully informed, because that's how it should be.
President-elect Donald Trump has also claimed credit in a Truth Social post, saying this epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory in November, as it signalled to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans and our allies. I am thrilled American and Israeli hostages will be returning home to be reunited with their families and loved ones. Analysis from Washington suggests both Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump's teams played a part.
It took President Trump's election to finally shake things up between the pressure he was putting on all parties involved, President Biden's desire to stop this before he left office, and the fact that I think the Israeli government had caused all the damage they could. I think all those factors together finally got us to the point where a ceasefire deal was struck.
It's most significant, though, for the people directly involved, relatives of the hostages who have some relief after waiting for months for news of their loved ones, to now hear the first phase of the deal will include the release of 33 people. And for the 2.3 million residents of Gaza, who have endured Israel killing more than 46,000 people in retaliation for Hamas taking hostages and killing 1,200 people on October 7th, 15 long months ago. This major deal coming just days before President Biden exits the White House and may be part of his legacy. But it may also provide a platform for President-elect Trump to build on the Abraham Accords, the normalization of relations between Israel and other countries in the region. The real question now, though, is once the ceasefire starts on Sunday, will it halt? Caroline Malone, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
I'm now joined by Daniel Levy, a former peace negotiator for Israeli governments and president of the US Middle East Project. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, Daniel. Daniel, let's start off with Joe Biden and Donald Trump. They're both taking credit for ceasefire talks. Does one administration have more sway over the other?
I don't think there's any doubt as to what's going on. People who want to be generous and polite can say, isn't this fabulous? Both an outgoing and an incoming administration can share whatever credit there is. That's not what's happened. Prime Minister Netanyahu realized quite some time ago that the Biden administration could be led by the nose. They refused to use their leverage with the Israeli side. They gave Israel all the arms, the money, the diplomatic, political, legal, economic backing. They even sang from the Israeli message sheet. And Israel knew that it could play those people. Now, I'm not suggesting that Trump came in and read the riot or had to promise things. But Netanyahu looked at Trump and said, which I think has happened in a number of places, this trepidation factor. He looked and said, this is a man who may act like the leader of a superpower. He's not going to do things to free the Palestinians, secure their rights, end the occupation. But he might do things that cut across my domestic political needs. And I'm not sure I know how to play him. And therefore, the only factor that mattered, Biden tells us these things take a long time. This would never happen if Blinken, liar-in-chief of this outgoing administration, and that team was still in office. But Prime Minister Netanyahu looked at this, and this is precisely the moment he never wanted to arrive at, to have to make this decision between his domestic political calculation and this uncertainty as to where the American president might go. And you can see that's exactly how it's played out today. Leigh Ann, Netanyahu doesn't want to go ahead with this because he knows that it causes him a very significant political headache at home with his coalition.
Yes, absolutely, Daniel. And Daniel, we're hearing the Israeli cabinet are to meet tomorrow to approve this brokered ceasefire agreement. Do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu has enough support to get this through? As you said, at home, he is facing factions.
So Leigh Ann, he has a majority inside his government. He has a majority inside his security cabinet, and he has a majority in the parliament. What he may not have is a coalition that exists today that could exist in the same contours tomorrow. I'm using tomorrow loosely, if he goes ahead and implements this deal. Two of the factions, the most extreme factions in what is in its entirety an extreme government, the two most extreme factions are threatening to oppose, are threatening to leave the government. They may well do so. Will they vote against the government? Will they bring it down? For the deal itself, he will have a safety net from the opposition. But going forward, his government might be in jeopardy, which is why I think what he's trying to achieve between today and tomorrow is nothing to do with the last-minute demands Hamas have made. Most of the retractions, most of the climb downs have come from Netanyahu because he was the one blocking a deal, not the lie we've been told by the Americans and others that it was Hamas that was the obstacle. They negotiated a hard bargain, but they stuck to their positions. Israel kept shifting its position. But what Netanyahu will hope that is in the coming day, he can do things to smooth some of these rougher edges inside his coalition. And then I think what we can expect is that Netanyahu, throughout this, will try to get out of the deal, torpedo the deal, prevent the deal from going forward while trying to place the blame on the other side. He probably looks at this and says, the Western leadership, the American leadership, eventually I'll be able to bring them on board. And he may well be correct, but he doesn't want to be in this place. And here he finds himself.
That moves me on to my next question, actually. Once an agreement is met, there are several stages of this deal that we have to consider. But Netanyahu has promised the hardliners in his cabinet that he will continue the war after the first phase does end. You've just hinted to it, but do you think this will be the case? Do you think we'll see the fighting, reignited after the first phase of the ceasefire deal?
There's a pretty strong consensus in both the pro and anti-Netanyahu camps, if you like, inside Israel, that will be his intention to continue this is very plausibly a genocide that Israel is conducting in Gaza. To continue those military operations, I would say, at the earliest opportunity, because the deal itself means, if it's implemented, that Israel would have to release a significant number of those Palestinians being held, thousands of them in Israeli prisons, often detention without trial, in order to get all the Israelis home. And Israel would have to withdraw militarily from Gaza. That would further entrench what is already beginning to emerge as an understanding that for all the death and destruction, this is not a war that Israel can claim to have won, partly because if you don't have a political plan for the day after, and Israel has no political plan other than killing more Palestinians, displacing more Palestinians, if you don't have a political plan, it's very hard to secure these things militarily. Hamas is still standing, and that's kind of the real problem in that bigger narrative for Netanyahu. But this matters. The fear that Netanyahu has had throughout, and he has today, is that once a deal starts getting implemented, things can take on a dynamic of their own. Once Israelis see that hostages come home alive, the pressure to continue with that, not to allow those who are still presumed to be alive but who wouldn't be part of the first phase, not to allow them to stay behind. Other dynamics, he doesn't want the world to see the destruction in Gaza. Most media outlets haven't been showing real scenes from inside Gaza. He doesn't want the humanitarian assistance to be ramped up. So this will take on a dynamic of its own, and he's worried that it won't be as easy to return to the fighting and the killing as he would like it to be. And that's something we'll see play out. I think he'll try. He may well succeed. He'll probably have Trump's support for that. But right now, we're in this might not be so easy. And therefore, hopefully we don't go there as far as he is concerned.
Former peace negotiator Daniel Levy, thank you so much for your insights this evening.
Thank you, Leigh Ann.
As well as a return of hostages and a withdrawal of Israeli troops, a ceasefire deal should involve a surge in humanitarian aid into Gaza. The United Nations have revealed that at least 1.9 million people have been displaced over the last 15 months of war, with 92% of housing units destroyed. 68% of road networks have been damaged, and 88% of school buildings requiring rebuilding or major repairs. For more on this, I'm now joined from Amman by Jonathan Fowler, a spokesperson for the UNRWA. Jonathan, a pleasure to speak to you this evening. The humanitarian situation is at catastrophic levels as aid trucks are waiting to enter Gaza. How is this uncertainty over the ceasefire impacting getting those critical supplies to people who need it the most?
Well, frankly, I mean, the ceasefire is an essential step when it's actually implemented to being able to scale up aid. But from the very beginning of this war, it has been impossible to get the scale of aid required in. So the needs, as you might imagine, if you can't get enough aid in, then the needs on the ground have been spiraling. This is an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. So all we actually need now is we need rapid, unhindered, safe and uninterrupted humanitarian access in order to deliver the vital supplies into Gaza and to respond to the tremendous suffering caused by this war. So we really hope that the deal will translate into an increased flow of a combination of humanitarian aid and commercial supplies, because the markets have to get going as well.
Since October the 7th, there is tremendous suffering caused by the conflict. What have been the major obstacles in the way for you and your teams operating and trying to get those necessary supplies into Gaza?
Well, there's multiple factors. And to begin with, getting aid across the border has been severely restricted. So there have been heavy inspections by the Israeli authorities. Trucks, for example, haven't been able to arrive fully loaded. They've had to arrive half loaded because that's easier to inspect. There have been items that we've not been able to get in, humanitarians generally, including UNRWA. There have been restrictions, for example, on tarpaulins to be able to erect tents during the winter weather, these kind of things. So replacing the supplies which are worn out and getting the necessary supplies in, certain kinds of medicine have also been banned. But that's just one part of the story. So getting aid to the border, then the aid needs to be offloaded onto trucks to distribute it within the Gaza Strip. And there, the utter breakdown of law and order and security within the Gaza Strip has rendered it extremely dangerous and very, very problematic for humanitarians to be able to do their job. We've had looting through desperation. We've had a rise in criminal gangs. We've had an utter failure of what we call deconfliction, which is what we do in any war zone as humanitarians. That's that we need to speak with the warring parties in order to ensure that we're able to move around in as much safety as possible. And we've had denials of convoys from the Israeli military, for example, being able to move around, these kind of things. Plus, and this is a significant factor, you cited the number of displaced people in your introduction to this report. The fact that people are displaced means that they're not necessarily tomorrow going to be where you are expecting to be able to deliver aid to them, because they received forced displacement orders to move around. So we do have to hope that a ceasefire will at least enable a cessation of that forced displacement, and that will enable us to get aid to people as necessary.
And let's just touch on that displacement. So nearly 2 million people, as we've just been talking about, have been displaced. If a ceasefire agreement is agreed, are these people actually able to return to any form of safety in Gaza anytime soon? We've seen the destruction of the houses, of the hospitals, of the schools, of critical infrastructure. I mean, what does the future hold?
Well, a fundamental desire, of course, that anybody has in such a situation is to go home. But as you quite rightly flag, the utter destruction means that people don't necessarily have homes to go to. But people will want to go back to their communities of origin to at least see what the situation is, whether their house is still half standing, standing completely, or indeed completely destroyed and a mound of rubble. But of course, the perils of moving around in an environment where there's so much destruction, the roads are littered with debris. There's unexploded ordnance all over the place. Tragically, there are huge numbers of people, dead bodies under the rubble. The lack of access, for example, to safe water, drinking water, food supplies, all these kind of things means that if people do want to try to go back to where they are, the supplies and what they need may not be easy to get to them and may not be there. So there are going to be population movements. It's also not clear, and at this stage, of course, we don't know exactly the terms of the deal, but it's not clear whether people will be able to go back to all areas of the Gaza Strip. And then the question is, who remains where and who is displaced? How do we deal with that kind of situation? So, I mean, all of this means that, yes, I mean, the guns need to fall silent in any war in order for humanitarians to be able to do their job more effectively. But that's just the beginning. It's just a stepping stone to being able to alleviate massive humanitarian disasters like this.
Jonathan Fowler, spokesperson for UNRWA, thank you so much for joining us and bringing us the news on the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. Qatar has called on Israel to withdraw from the Golan Heights buffer zone during a joint conference with the new Syrian leader. It comes during the Qatari Prime Minister's visit to Damascus. Israel has seized much of the area after the fall of the Assad regime. Syria's Ahmed al-Sharaa says he is counting on Doha's support to stop Israel from making further advances. The US has imposed hundreds of sanctions targeting Russia in the final days of the Biden administration. The new curbs target 100 critical Russian entities, including banks and companies in the energy sector. It also takes aim at the country's evasion of US sanctions and its military-industrial base. A reversal of these new sanctions does require Congress to be notified. The winds in California are finally dying down, helping firefighters to control the blaze. Over 12,000 structures have been destroyed, and residents and business owners look at a months-long timeline for rebuilding. The death toll remains at 25, and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass warns that they are not out of the woods yet. Bollywood actor Saif Ali Khan is recovering after he was stabbed by an intruder in his home. The knife attack is believed to have taken place during a burglary attempted in Mumbai. Local authorities are investigating the incident. Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin has successfully launched its first rocket powerful enough to send satellites into space. The New Glenn's debut flight took off from Cape Canaveral in Florida. The Blue Ring Pathfinder technology on board was successfully carried into orbit, but the reusable booster did not make its way back to the landing station. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has signed a 100-year partnership treaty between the UK and Ukraine during his visit to Kyiv today. The UK says the 100-year pledge includes support in defence, energy and trade. Starmer also promised a further £40 billion to support Ukraine's recovery post-war and sat down with President Zelensky to discuss a joint ceasefire plan with France. Here's what Starmer had to say Olly about the intention of the trip.
One of the consequences of this conflict has been to draw NATO more strongly together. It's bigger and stronger than it has been, and we must stand behind Ukraine for as long as it takes. But when we say Ukraine must be in the strongest possible position, that can't be just words. And that's why I've had such intense discussions with President Zelensky now over the months that I've been Prime Minister, and will again here in Ukraine.
Let's go live to London now to speak to our correspondent, Olly Barratt. Olly, quite a promise from the Prime Minister there and a genuine guarantee for Ukraine. How has this trip gone down in London while the country battles real uncertain times in the economy?
Well, I think part of the uncertainty around the economy means that perhaps Keir Starmer got rather less attention from British media than he might have done on a trip to Kyiv in different times when there wasn't so much going on domestically in the news agenda here, but also with regards to the ceasefire or lack thereof until this point in Gaza. But at the same time, the support for Ukraine that Britain has been pledging and sending over the last couple of years has pretty broad-based political support here in the UK. So this isn't the kind of pledge that is going to be criticised by opposition parties here in the UK. It has that broad support and that remains. The interesting thing about this 100-year partnership is what the UK is trying to do is really signal that its support and cooperation will be there with the Ukrainians, not just through the course of the conflict that is still playing out, but beyond any type of ceasefire that might be able to be reached in some kind of peace deal at some point in the future. So the UK trying to signal that it does want to cooperate with regards to the economy, technology and health, not just in the area of defence going forward.
I just actually want to correct myself quickly, Olly. I said Starmer also promised a further £40 million to support Ukraine's recovery post-war. That's £40 million. Let's just move on. Donald Trump takes over the White House next week. We know he has plans to speak to President Putin. Could Starmer's pledge to Ukraine cause any kind of diplomatic difficulty between the UK and the new incoming US administration?
Well, I don't think it will be any surprise to the incoming Trump administration. They know the British position here. They know that this type of pledge is the type of thing Britain has been rolling out over the last couple of years and is likely to continue to do so. There is the potential, though, for difficulties down the line in the bilateral relationship if Donald Trump were to deviate significantly from the previous US position of support for Ukraine. Now, I think there is cautious optimism here in London that actually Donald Trump and his incoming administration aren't going to just immediately withdraw support for the Ukrainians and perhaps move over closer to a Russian position with regards to trying to find an out in this conflict around some kind of peace deal or ceasefire. There's been a lot of diplomacy going on between the UK and incoming figures in the Trump administration to try and make the case that actually Ukraine does need ongoing support and will need to be supported up to, during and beyond any type of peace negotiations with Russia, and needs to be put in the strongest position possible for those talks. But if Donald Trump and Keir Starmer were to start to move apart in their positions when it comes to exactly what to do about Ukraine and Russia and any potential further peace talks, there is the potential there for diplomatic difficulties between Washington and London further down the line.
Yes, we'll have to wait and see further down the line. Olly Barratt in London, thank you so much for joining me. Let's take a look at the top business news. BP is cutting over 5% of its global workforce as part of the CEO's plan to reduce costs and rebuild investor confidence in the energy giant. Around 4,700 employees and 3,000 contractor positions will be cut this year, according to an internal memo which was released today. The CEO, Murray Auchincloss, is aiming to cut at least $2 billion in costs by 2026. Lufthansa is set to resume flights to and from Tel Aviv in Israel at the beginning of next month. The German airline made the announcement as Wizz Air restarted its London to Tel Aviv route today, following a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. Many Western carriers cancelled flights to swathes of the Middle East in recent months, including Beirut and Tel Aviv, as conflict tore across the region. Let's go to sport now, and it was another packed day of action at the Australian Open. Emma Raducanu started off with a victory over Amanda Anisimov. She sets up a third-round tie against world number 2 Iga Swiatek. But it was a bad news for British number 1 Katie Boulter, who was beaten in a roller coaster match. Defending champion Jannik Sinner is through to the third round, along with American Taylor Fritz. Liverpool forward Mo Salah could be making a move to the Saudi Pro League, with reports of a £65 million deal across 2 seasons. Salah's contract with the Merseyside club expires in the summer, and the Egyptian is yet to sign an extension. The 32-year-old has won 8 trophies at Anfield during his time at the club. Now, he's the former British Chancellor who also oversaw the UK's COVID-19 vaccination programme. And today, Nadhim Zahawi has been announced as the chair of the advisory board of Ador Diagnostics, an Israeli medical group which aims at detecting and managing infectious diseases. And he joins me now from London. Welcome, Nadhim Zahawi. First of all, tell us about this new role and what Ador Diagnostics is aiming to achieve, especially with you on the board now.
Thank you for having me on. Yes, I'm very excited about Ador. During the pandemic, and of course, you remember I was the vaccine deployment minister for the United Kingdom, we all heard about PCR testing. I think the whole world had to be tested and retested over and over again. What Ador have developed is a much more powerful, in my view, testing platforms called rolling circle amplification. So RCA, you will begin to hear much more about than PCR. It's patented by Ador. It's backed by Mike Milken's family office and Howard Shaw of Shaw Capital in the UK. And the exciting thing about it is, at the moment, if you go to a doctor with a chest infection, they rarely know forensically which pathogen happens to be in your lungs. Ador will be able to give forensic detail of over 100 different pathogens in 30 to 45 minutes. So near patient diagnosis becomes incredibly powerful. Full automation, so it doesn't need an expert to actually conduct the test. And of course, geomapping in future outbreaks makes it very powerful technology. And I'm excited about the future. We've got preclinical validation in the Rome Lazaris Spallanzani Institute, one of the most important institutes there. That's after successful preclinical validation that took place in Israel, in Tel Aviv. So it's an exciting business. I think in diagnostics world, this is probably one of the most interesting businesses that I've certainly had the privilege to get to know well and to chair the advisory board. So I'm very excited about the role.
Mr. Zahawi, I must say, I remember PCR tests extremely well. Now, you've just spoken about Ador. It's a technology-based health company. How are you planning on making this attractive to the public? And will it be regularly used in global healthcare systems like the NHS? Because, like you said, it can trace the pathogens and it can know what possible infection you have. So it could cut down a lot of waiting times. We've seen a lot of backlog in the NHS.
I think it certainly can do that. It can, we think, we're confident we can detect everything from over 100 different pathogens to stomach ulcers, to sepsis. So you'll have a number of benefits. Obviously, one is cutting down infections, which is probably the ultimate benefit, but also the right use of antibiotics, because at the moment, if a doctor doesn't know which pathogen you have in your lungs, they normally just prescribe an antibiotic and sort of, cross their fingers and hope for the best. Whereas with Ador's diagnostic technology, we'll be much more forensic about the diagnosis and which pathogen exactly that it needs to be treated. So really exciting for different healthcare systems, not just in the United Kingdom, but I think also in the Middle East, whether it's in, I'm hoping to talk to some of my colleagues in Saudi and the UAE and other places. But once we've got the preclinical validation, which we're confident in because we've had it from Israel, from Italy, from Rome.
Ador is an Israeli medical group. Your chairman is a former first lieutenant in the Israel Navy. What's your reaction to the ceasefire? And will Israel now have the chance to show her best self, as I know you once said in Parliament?
I did. And I absolutely am confident that Israel will now have an opportunity to show the best of herself. I hope that we can build on this ceasefire, that the families who've been waiting so anxiously for their loved ones to be returned home, and for those who sadly lost loved ones to have finality and closure, and of course for the Palestinian people who have been suffering under the hands of the terrorist Hamas, will have a sort of a new dawn. The day after plan, I think, is probably the most important thing to focus on now. And I have to say, as part of that, I think there needs to be a government of technocrats rather than, dare I say, if he can be persuaded, which I think he can be, Abu Mazen actually handing the baton over to a group that can deliver for the beleaguered Palestinian people.
And I just want to ask you a quick question. I remember you being a Chancellor, of course, and what advice would you give to Rachel Reeves right now? She's going through a pretty torrid time. And I think, what's your take on the current UK economy? And honestly, what do you think Rachel Reeves should do?
I think it's self-inflicted, I'm afraid. I think it's heartbreaking. I say this more in sorrow than in anger, that I told you so. You don't get growth by increasing the burden of taxation on the workforce, which is what Rachel has done. You don't get growth without understanding what business investment needs in the United Kingdom. You don't get growth by attacking our farmers with the farm tax or an inheritance tax. What I wanted to do as part of my growth round was abolish inheritance tax altogether. You'll see many more family trusts from around the world would look at the UK as an investment destination. And I think it's absolutely doable. It's an unfair tax. It's double taxation in many ways. And I would also have introduced an enterprise residency where you look at what Prime Minister Meloni's done in Italy, where you can now live in Italy, pay 200,000 euros per adult. We are, I think, more attractive than Italy in the United Kingdom. And that would have more than compensated for the loss of taxation from the inheritance tax. I'd do something for small business and on business rates for the small retailers on the high street who are really suffering in the UK. But unfortunately, this government chose to give train drivers a massive uplift in wages, pretty much gave in to most of the unions very early on in their term. And the result is where we've ended up today, where there's very much a hiatus in the markets when it comes to UK government gilts. Why? Because people don't feel that the Chancellor is competent enough. And it really is a very, very sad state of affairs.
Nadhim Zahawi, thank you so much. Much to say there, the UK did return to growth today for the first time in 3 months, but I hope Rachel Reeves is listening to your advice.
Anemic growth.
And a reminder of our top stories. The Israeli cabinet will meet on Friday to approve the brokered ceasefire agreement. Both US President Joe Biden and incoming President Donald Trump claim credit for the ceasefire talks. And the UK promises Ukraine a 100-year partnership to support the country's defence, energy and trade as a Russian drone is shot down from the sky. Thank you from us on W News. Thank you for joining us. Coming up next, we have special interviews with the former Lebanese Prime Minister, with the former Lebanese MP Sami Fatfat and Israeli's Energy Minister Eli Cohen. And don't miss Tom Burgess-Watson with GNT. Good night.